talking about crisis communication and specifically related to climate change. These things, of course, span decades. So let's just start at the beginning and talk about when when a communication and climate change really started coming to fruition at its core.
Those of us who are in the sciences, climate science being no exception, we harbor a belief that once we've learned something that's important, that all we have to do is tell people about it, maybe only once, and they'll get it and they'll do something about it. Because as scientists, our job is to understand the world, to do research to help understand the world better. We don't necessarily think of our job as to figure out what to do about how to fix problems that our science reveals. So there's been this deep belief in the climate science community for many, many decades, really since the field began, or at least once the science became clear enough to know with certainty that the global climate is changing, that human activity is driving that change, and that we need to do something about it. And ever since that has been clear, there's been a belief in the climate science community that people will get it, that the public will get it, that our elected leaders will get it, and they'll do something about it. Unfortunately, the brief history of climate change has been such that, some people get it, some elected officials get it, and generally speaking, we haven't really done much about it.
What do you think the inciting incident really was that kind of changed the narrative the very first time about climate change? Is it the 70s? Is it the gas crisis? Is it near the turn of the millennia? When is our first real notion that this is becoming a problem?
So the legend has it, I think your question's a great question. I don't think there's a simple answer, but the legend has it that NASA climate scientist James Hansen testified in front of Congress on a sweltering DC July day in the summer, July of 1988, I believe it was, and he issued a very clear warning that human-caused climate change is a reality, and that it is going to create problems of cataclysmic dimensions unless we do something about it. And that was, in some respects, I think perhaps the first clear wake-up call in the US, but unfortunately, like most people throughout their day and their evening, one wake-up call is not enough. You need to be woken up the next day, and the next day we need an alarm clock every day in order to get up and go to work and do what needs to be done. So the fact that there was a clear wake-up call issued in the summer of '88 was helpful, but not sufficient.
So that would have been during the H.W. administration, H.W. Bush, at that time. When did it sort of, as you mentioned, it just faded again back into the back of our minds? Is it Gulf War? Is it we don't see anything immediate, so we don't relate to it? It's that idea of distance and maybe dissonance. At what point did it just fall back before we head to 2001? All of a sudden, an inconvenient truth comes along. What are those years in between like?
Yeah, in terms of trying to wake the public up about the nature of the problem that we face, I would, for me, there's no defining incident anywhere between, or defining moment anywhere between '88 and 2006. And maybe that's the case because I'm just like everybody else in the country. I wasn't paying a whole lot of attention at that time. I'm a public health professional by training, and I was working on frankly, I was doing anti-tobacco work at the time, trying to figure out ways to make sure that the next generation of kids didn't become addicted to nicotine, and I was working on vaccine safety communication and a whole variety of things. But I wasn't particularly focused on global warming. But for me, the next big wake-up call was issued in 2006 when An Inconvenient Truth came out, and it was a very clear signal. It got a lot of attention. A lot of people went to see the movie. A lot of people heard about the movie, but it had an inconvenient truth. The inconvenient truth had an inconvenient truth to it, and that was it was an idea, a warning brought to us by a Democratic politician, Al Gore, who was the vice president of the U.S. for 8 years, a senator for many years before that, and was almost the president of the United States. So In 2006, when the conversation restarted in earnest, thanks to an inconvenient truth, it became, by almost by default, it became a hyper-polarized partisan conversation.
So we'll get to, I want to touch back with your framing of being a public health communications professional here in just a moment, because I think that framing, especially I read some of your work in 2008 and 2010, about framing climate change as a public health issue really being something that was completely important on trying to change the attitudes going forward. But you mentioned, of course, it being Al Gore. I mean, is that really the defining moment in history for us within the last 2 decades, where global warming just isn't even a problem anymore if you have a conservative mindset, at least in 2006, and it really just became this big polarizing issue? They just didn't want to listen to Al Gore.
Yeah, and in fact, the polarization started even earlier. The polarization started, I would say, in the late 1990s, when Al Gore was our vice president and Bill Clinton was our president, and Al Gore went to Kyoto, Japan, to negotiate the Kyoto Protocol on behalf of the U.S. and in the late 90s. And at that time, 2 out of 3 Americans accepted the reality of climate change and expressed some degree of concern about it. The interesting thing about the late 90s is there was no difference between the way conservative Americans and liberal Americans thought about the issue. 2 out of 3 in both camps, if you will, accepted this reality and were somewhat concerned about it. Over the ensuing 2 decades, I think in part, well, many causes, but over the ensuing decades, almost all liberal Americans, almost all Democrats have become convinced of the reality of human-caused climate change, and they become increasingly concerned with each passing, we'll say with each passing couple of years. The reverse is true among conservative or Republican Americans, and that is, while they started at 2 out of 3 believing in accepting the realities of climate change, fewer, they began to change their mind in the late 90s and the aughts and the teens, becoming convinced that they had it wrong before, that either climate change isn't real, or it's not human caused, or even if human caused climate change is a reality, it's not really a very serious threat. And the kinds of solutions that elected officials would like to develop, the kinds of policies they'd like to develop, their concern was that those would create bigger problems than any problem associated with climate change itself.
So then where did it go wrong? In terms of, did they flip their minds because of, I'm sure it's a variety of reasons that you're going to get into, religion, in that view saying it's happened before, it's in God's hands, natural variability, where they said, nope, this has happened again before, we're not going to do anything about it, or strictly the fear of how much it would change their lives, and so you just put it out of your mind and you compartmentalize that because you just don't want to deal with it. Yeah. All 3, more than 3,
all of the above and more, but I'm actually, and reality's complicated, right? There's lots of moving parts to our lives and to our country, and all of those, many moving parts have influenced this progressive realization among liberals that this is a serious problem, and the progressive walking away from acknowledging it as a serious problem among conservatives. But I'm going to point to one that I think is particularly important, and the one is the fact that the fossil fuel industry, this is their economic livelihood on the line. They could have decided, all right, like the Pony Express, which was going to clearly be supplanted by the railroad, and eventually railroads got supplanted by the interstate highway system and airlines. The fossil fuel industry could have decided, we're going to reinvent ourselves as a better kind of energy industry. But they decided not to do that. They decided it's better to try to forestall any form of any change to their business for as long as humanly possible, because it is the most profitable business in human history, right? And it has created enormous prosperity, over the past 2 decades because it's a highly concentrated, highly efficient form of fuel. It's a great way to run vehicles and produce electricity. The problem is there are a whole bunch of serious side effects of that great form of energy. One of which is that it's destabilizing our climate worldwide, and that worldwide climate change is having ramifications in every community in America.
I paid $4 for gas today in Pennsylvania.
So let me just add one last thought to
Yeah.
that. So the fossil fuel industry has many reasons to want to either deny or ignore or diminish the threats associated with global climate change, even though they've known perhaps earlier than anyone else, because they actually funded much of the early climate science research. They've known for a very long time that their product, when used as designed, is going to destabilize our global climate. But rather than decide to innovate, do the thing that American corporations do so uniquely well, innovate and create better products that meet our needs better than the old products, they decided, no, we're going to deny, we're going to delay, we're going to dismiss. And ultimately, I think that was the start of, or put into play all of the other forces in our society that have led us to not own up to the problem that we face until now.
Yeah, I've found research as early as the 70s of oil companies funding that sort of research to see, and of course it was just easier not to innovate. So then once we get to the end of the aughts, as you said, beginning of the teens, end of the Bush era, beginning of the Obama era, we're seeing oil and gas lobbies even become more and more powerful. So at this point, they just latch on to conservative Republicans, both in the House and the Senate, and go from there at that point, and those conservatives then control the narrative of their constituents, essentially.
Well,
Yes and no?
it's a wonderful thing to be the world's richest industry, because it spins off lots of extra cash that you can use to make sure that things are going to go well for your industry in the future. One of the ways you can use your extra cash is to buy friends. And in this case, the fossil fuel industry bought a whole lot of friends in politics, people in high places, who have essentially also, denied and delayed and doubted, all the way to the present. But even the fossil fuel industry in the present day is no longer denying. They are still actively seeking to delay any sort of change in their business, but they're using a very different story. Now what they're telling us, they're no longer telling us climate change isn't a problem. They're totally willing to own up to the fact that it's a problem, but the story they're telling us now is that, don't worry, we got this. Like, we're investing in biofuels, using algae to produce biofuels, and we're investing in renewable energy, and we're investing in carbon capture, capturing the heat trapping pollution while when we burn the fuels, so that we don't put it into the atmosphere where it's causing a problem. And all of unlike what they were telling us previously, which is this isn't a problem, now they're admitting it's a problem. So in a sense, they're telling the truth, but they're telling a very selective version of the truth, which is, yes, they are doing those things. They are investing in clean energy. They are investing in biofuels, but it's a little niche side business for them. They are not reinventing their industry.
We go from, 30% in 2010, either viewing or responding as completely disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive that climate is an issue, to 35% back in 2011, to 2018, where all of a sudden we're seeing 46% of Americans see this as a high top priority to take care of, on top of even more viewing it as real. What that change in the 10 years? Is it the change in framework of how we communicate the climate crisis to a public health issue? What drives that increase or decrease in terms of also the Trump era?
Yeah. So as a meteorologist, you know all too well what climate scientists have been telling us for decades now will happen. Namely, they've been telling us that the weather is going to get worse. It's not only going to get warmer, in some places much hotter, but it's essentially making our weather less predictable than it used to be and more dangerous than it used to be, extreme weather events. And so you've seen it, and during the course of your career, you've seen the weather becoming more dangerous in central Pennsylvania, and your viewers have seen it too. Those who are connecting the dots between what they've been hearing about climate change and what's actually happening in their skies and in their streams and rivers, those are the ones who are becoming much more concerned.
All right, so
cue me up with that question.
Yep. So let's go back to the last decade, Obama era, Trump era, now start of the Biden era, and how this has changed. And we haven't really talked about the reframing as a public health issue, which we can, but you're on more on the lines of saying it. People are believing it because now they're seeing it.
So 10 years ago, when we started conducting polling of the public to see what they knew about climate change, most Americans accepted the reality of climate change. Even most Republicans accepted the reality of climate change 10 years ago, but they saw it as a distant problem. Distant in time, like maybe 2100 or maybe even 2075, but not 2010. Distant in space, sub-Saharan Africa, sure. My community, nah. And distant in species. Polar bears, yeah, absolutely. I can see how global warming is bad for polar bears, but it's not really bad for people, not bad for my people here in my community. But then, the thing that climate scientists were warning us would happen, that our weather would start getting worse, it's becoming increasingly obvious over the past decade with each I don't want to say with each passing year, but over time we're seeing more and more extreme weather events, and we're seeing them closer and closer to home. Many of us are experiencing them in our hometown. And once it becomes present, literally present in our lives, and not in a good way, people start to reevaluate what they've heard about global warming, and they start to make the connection that, oh yeah, it does seem to be here now, and it does seem to be affecting us. And I want to give you and your colleagues in broadcast meteorology a big shout out for helping to connect the dots. Because 10 years ago, there were very, very few broadcast meteorologists who were talking about climate change, helping their viewers understand it. But now, like you, there are a lot of weathercasters who are engaged in trying to help people understand that the changes in the weather in their community, it's not random. And by the way, dear viewer, if you think you've noticed that things are changing, you're right. Let me show you the data. Let me show you the data here, in our town. And it's pretty clear, weather is getting more dangerous.
Let's talk about that framework a little bit, and when it became important to your industry, specifically as well, is it seeing, the more extreme weather events? Was there a particular inciting incident where communication specialists were saying, we have to frame this as a public health issue, as well as maybe things as a national security issue, as, obviously a future issue that kind of helped propel that narrative for global warming as well?
Yes, so that you chose to use the word narrative. It means telling a story, right? A lot of different stories that could be told about climate change. The effects on polar bears is not the only story that can be told. However, it was the story that was told over and over and over again, and that's why most Americans came to see climate change or global warming as a threat to polar bears. But as you suggested, it's also a threat to us. It's a threat to our health. Dangerous weather is dangerous because it's harmful. People get injured and or killed during extreme weather events. And there are a whole variety of different ways in which climate change is harming the health of Americans across the country already. I happen to be trained as a public health doctor, if you will. And so as somebody with public health training, I was interested in whether or not telling the story about how climate change is harming our health would help people reach a different conclusion or a different decision about climate change, and would help them recognize the skin in the game. Our skin in the game is quite literally our skin. And what we've learned through our research is, yes, actually it's really helpful to understand that it's not just about polar bears, but it's about people. It's about the health of my child, the health of my father-in-law. And And moreover, there's another half of the story. When you tell the story of how climate change harms our health, it creates another opportunity to tell a story which is probably the most important story that needs to be told right now, which is that climate solutions are also health solutions. The very things we need to do, that we most need to do to address climate change, are incredibly, profoundly good for our health. You stop burning dirty fuel and you start creating energy from clean, renewable sources, almost overnight, you clean up the air and the water, which almost overnight allows us to live more healthfully. So the beauty of addressing climate change as a human health issue is that it allows us to talk about climate solutions as health solutions that we can enjoy almost immediately and we can enjoy right here in our community. We're not just giving a gift. If we do the right thing here in our community, we're not just enjoying it a little bit and also giving a gift to everybody else in the world, but we're actually the primary beneficiaries right here. We get to enjoy cleaner air, cleaner water, and better health right away.
From 2006 to now with your most recent data as of last night in 2021, what has been the, I'm glad that only happened once, what has been the ebbs and flows that you've seen in terms of public belief, things that have maybe either helped or hurt, and the state of where we are now?
So the research on that point is incredibly clear, that we're mostly listening to what our elected officials are saying about climate change, perhaps because they've got the biggest the biggest microphone. They have we pay attention to them because they're talking about a whole variety of issues that affect our lives. And when our politicians talk about the realities of climate change, the seriousness of climate change, and the fact that climate solutions are actually good for us in a whole variety of ways, and including good for our environment, good for our health, and good for our economy, we tend to see a continued uptick in acceptance of climate change and concern about it and support for climate solutions. Conversely, when our politicians, our elected officials, are saying the reverse, it tends to put a damper on the increase in public concern about the issue. So during the Obama years, there was a fairly sharp increase in public concern. During the Trump years, there was a bit of a decrease in public concern, especially among conservatives. Right now, we're seeing a strong increase. We're actually seeing historically high levels of concern among Americans about the reality of climate change, and historically high levels of support for politicians to do the right things.
Especially, I'd imagine, after both withdrawing from and re-enrolling in the Paris Climate Accords, that kind of thing as well. Two more questions off the top of my head, especially since we have looming thunder, although I think we'll be okay. Firstly, is why do you think the American public is so susceptible to, obviously we have swings in power between Democratic and Republican, but on issues like climate change that really affect their health, why do you think that it seems, anyway, that they're so easily influenced?
We're not so easily influenced. We being the public, human beings, we are not so easily influenced. We actually have really pretty good defense mechanisms to resist persuasive efforts, to resist attempts to influence us. But what we know, people like me who study communication, what we know is the most powerful way to shape people's beliefs is simple, clear messages, repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. We have been, the fossil fuel industry and their friends have been issuing simple, clear messages repeatedly through a variety of trusted voices for a very long time now. So the fact that it's taken us, the public, a long time to understand the reality of climate change has little to do with the fact that we're not paying attention to what climate scientists have been trying to teach us, but it has everything to do with the fact that the industry that has a lot of money and has the ability to buy their way into our attention span, they've been issuing simple, clear messages repeatedly for decades, and through and in trusted vehicles. So, for example, the New York Times, a newspaper that does a great job reporting the climate science, they also run a whole lot of advertorials paid for by the fossil fuel industry. So often right next to the climate science articles. So it's really a matter of, it's not a matter of we're gullible. It's just a matter of when we hear it over and over and over again, it begins to shape how we see the world.
What's next for a successful further transition in climate communication? Is it the continued framework not only as a health issue but as a national security and an economic issue? Is it we're waiting and the proof is in the pudding for the weather events that are happening? We're saying, hey, we warned you about this and it's now happening. Is it some of the old, some more new things coming along?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing that needs to happen in order to improve public understanding of climate change is we got to bring it home. We got to bring it to people, show people how it is changing conditions in their lives, in their hometown. And that's what journalists do well, right? That's what broadcast meteorologists do well. That's what public officials, local public officials can do well if they choose to. The news business is a tough business right now. It's hard for them to bring on climate reporters, for example. But I'm hoping and working actively towards bringing more money into the news industry that will support local climate reporting, because we need to understand what's happening in our backyard, because we have real serious decisions to make. And until we understand the nature of what's happening in our backyard as a result of global climate change, we're not going to be very capable of making the best possible decisions. So journalism, the work of TV weathercasters, the work of local officials, doctors and nurses in our community talking about how it's harming our health, those are really important trusted voices that we need to support so that we can better understand the risks, the threats that we face, and make better decisions about how best to deal with them.
Interesting question, completely unrelated to climate change directly anyway. And this will be my last really kind of go ahead. Does the current state of our views around COVID concern you as a communication specialist for believing the science when it comes to climate?
Yeah, absolutely it does. And it comes back to what I said earlier about the power of simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. We all get to choose who we trust and who we distrust. And when we see it's serious issues of human health and well-being becoming polarized by partisanship, by the left versus the right, that's a real concern to me. And we've seen it very clearly with regard to COVID, and we've seen it very clearly with regard to climate change. My hope is that we can pull the issue of climate change and that we can pull the issue of COVID back out of the culture wars in America, and we can start dealing with it like adults again and looking at the evidence of what our problems really are and what the best possible solutions are. I think that's what makes this country great when we do that, and I'm pretty confident we can get to great again.
So the answer doesn't lie in the problem lies in the politics. The solution certainly is not saying the more liberalist views need to attract conservatives again. It's we need to pull this out of politics to make people who don't trust climate change trust it again.
Absolutely. I have a colleague and a friend. His name is Bob Inglis. He served 6 terms in the U.S. Congress representing his district in South Carolina. And ever since he lost his job early in 2011, because he had entered as a sitting U.S. congressman, he proposed climate legislation. And in his next election, he had 4 different challengers, Republican challengers for his seat, who basically treated him as having committed a fundamental sin against the party, against the country, against the world, which was embracing an idea that liberals talk about. But Bob's point was then, when he introduced climate legislation, and ever since then, his point was, look, being on the wrong side of science is bad for the party, bad for the country, and bad for the world. So let's put the partisan politics aside and let's actually look at what our problems are and have a dialogue like mature adults to figure out what do we want to do about it collectively.
Danielle, anything?
I have one question. You say a lot of the solutions come from meteorologists, come from our reporting, doctors. What about those people? I meet people all the time, they don't watch the news. Or maybe low income places, you're not going to the doctor all the time. How do we get messaging across to those communities?
Yeah, so
It's hard.
well, ultimately, the people that we trust the most are our friends and family. We see this in our surveys time and time again. We ask people who respond to our surveys, how much do you trust climate scientists? How much do you trust politicians? How much do you trust broadcast meteorologists? How much do you trust your friends and family about information about global warming? And time again, friends and family, they're right up there at the top of the trust list because we know them the best, we care about them the most, and therefore we come to know that they have our backs. So I think the most important thing we need to accomplish is when the experts have all shared what they have to share, but then we start talking to each other about it. Because once we start talking to each other about it, then that conversation involves everybody.
Is there anything as the rain comes down that you would like to add that we haven't discussed? Some big picture issue that I didn't bring up that you weren't able to talk about that is critical to this story?
Yeah, one, things change, right? The world, in some ways, the world just cycles back and continues to be the same, changes a little bit and goes back to the way it was. But one thing that has changed to the extreme is the economics of generating clean, renewable energy. When this whole public conversation about global warming started 30 years ago, it was truly the case that fossil fuel energy was cheaper and more reliable. Now, it's actually the case in most of the country and in most of the world that generating energy with clean renewable sources is cheaper and can be equally, if not more reliable. So we're still a really important misperception out there that most people hold, and I'm not just talking about the public, I'm talking about most professionals and members of even most of our elected officials. They hold an important misperception that clean energy is somehow the transitioning our country and our world to run on clean energy is too expensive. In fact, the economics are really clear. It would be cheaper for us to do it, and the sooner we do it, the sooner we start to save money and create ultimately the conditions for a more prosperous society.
80s, 90s, odds events that you think that we kind of missed that were not necessarily inciting incidents, but maybe continue to help shape that narrative?
Yeah. Events only go so far in terms of changing public attitudes and the public conversation. But some events do tend to be somewhat catalytic. Signing the Paris Climate Agreement, when every country in the world in 2005 came together after being incapable of coming together to actually propose a viable plan to limit the warming of the planet, they came together in 2015 in Paris, the Paris Climate Agreement. And I think that was a catalytic event because it showed us that the people we send to represent our interests, they're actually willing to do the people's business. And not just in our community, not just in our country, but all around the world. And we saw in our polling during the Trump era that most Americans, including most Republicans, were really for staying in the Paris Climate Agreement. They didn't like the fact that Donald Trump pulled us out. And I think it's sort of a flag in the sand that we believe in, we see a value in it, and we want to defend it.
All right as the rain starts, if you want to hang out underneath